All right, well, welcome. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. I'm really excited about the conversation we're about to host. My name is Jen Lowe. I am the Executive Director for the Equality State Policy Center. Welcome to the People's Review Live, hosted by us, ESPC. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit organization working to improve the lives of all Wyoming's people through transparent government, fair elections, and thriving communities. The People's Review Live is designed to help people across the state engage on important issues and hear from experts on a variety of experiences and expertise. When we work together, we can ensure transparent government, fair elections, and thriving communities. And that's never been more important than now. This event is possible thanks to the generous support of our People's Review Live Leadership Circle members, including Marcia Kunstel and Joe Albright, JoAnn Skeim-True and Skeim-True, Mike Chauncey and Kathy Jenkins, and an anonymous donor. Thank you. If you'd like to know how to become a Leadership Circle member, please email me, Jen Lowe, and you can find my email in the chat or on our website. Just as a reminder, this meeting is in a webinar format, so the panelists can see and hear each other. And while we can't see you, we do encourage you to put your questions into the chat feature anytime during the conversation. Also, we are recording this panel to ensure you can view it later. If for some reason you can't see or hear the panelists right now, or you have tech issues during the meeting, contact me and I'll do my best to help. Just send a chat and I'll do my best. Please welcome our moderator, JoAnn Skeim-True. Thank you so much. JoAnn is a close friend and I'm excited to have her tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thank you, Jen. Before we jump into our discussion, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First panelist is Representative Shelly Duncan. Shelly came to Casper, Wyoming with her family in 1977, where her father worked in the oil field. Shelly studied interior design and art at Lamar University, and in 2005 became a licensed real estate agent in Wyoming and Nebraska. In 2009, she became a broker and started to climb the leadership ladder within the industry. In the spring of 2018, she filed to run for the House District number 5 race for the Wyoming Legislature. She has successfully passed as lead sponsor for 9 bills in her 4 years as House Representative for District 5. Welcome, Representative Duncan. Next panelist is Matt Germer. Matt is a resident elections fellow for the governance program at R Street Institute. Before joining R Street, Matt was a policy counsel and strategic planning coordinator at the Washington State House of Representatives. There, he drafted legislation and offered strategic counsel on a variety of legislative matters, including elections, taxes, energy, criminal justice, and technology. Prior to that, he served as nonpartisan staff in the Oregon State Legislature, worked as a public policy analyst in the healthcare industry, and helped launch a real estate marketing startup. Our final panelist this evening is Stan Lockhart. Stan has worked in the technology and public service field for over 25 years. During this time, he has contributed to numerous important public policy and citizen initiatives. He learned a great deal about the state legislature during his late wife, Becky Lockhart's service as the first female speaker in the House of Utah. During her time of service, he formed relationships with many of Utah's political leaders. Stan has been working with our team on election reform in Wyoming and can't wait to chat about it more. Thank you all for being here with us tonight. As a reminder, viewers may submit questions using the chat or Q&A feature. Let's get started. For tonight's PR Live, we have a short presentation from each speaker before we transition into our Q&A. Representative Shelly Duncan.
Thanks, JoAnn and Jen. I don't normally address this formally, but I'm actually at a black tie event here in Orlando, Florida for real estate. So I'm here with you guys. It's 7 o'clock here, so it's I think 5 o'clock your time. So I was asked to loosely discuss and talk about elections, mainly statewide. There's a few things that I noticed. I lost my reelection. It was the ugliest election in history. And the more I keep talking to other people, not only in my community, but across the state, a lot of the nasty lies, literal lies, untruths, incredible money from out of state, out of the community, was infiltrated into this election. The amount of money spent into this election was record breaking across the entire state, not just my election, but across the state. One of the things that that we found that was really interesting is there was a lot of new voters. I didn't understand some of this phenomenon, but there was a group that went and targeted these uneducated, as in they don't know the issues. Not that they were uneducated, but they just weren't educated about the issues and the policies and the things that were going on. They would target them, get them emotionally involved. And then because we have same-day registration and we have early voting, they would emotionally attack and identify with them and send them to the courthouse and have them vote immediately. So they were uneducated, they didn't know, they pulled in their passion and had them vote. Now, I thought that was unique to my area. It wasn't. It was, I don't know if it was a sophisticated plan, but that's what's happened across several communities. Another thing that I noticed and talked about other people was that there was kind of this, we're gonna talk about the elephant in the room, the Liz Cheney effect. And what that was is that it seemed to be an incumbent referendum down ballot because of Liz Cheney. Whether she was right, whether she was wrong, didn't matter on the issue. But down ballot incumbents were affected, whether it was school board, whether it was city council, whether it was a sheriff, no matter what the race, no matter what level, local, state, national, down ballot incumbents were affected. And with vigor and vitriol, it's just all over. It was really ugly. In my local race, we had people who were talking about being constitutional sheriffs. Well, what is a constitutional sheriff? It's not written in a constitution. It's not written in the state constitution. So there was a lot of things that were just made up and people bought it. There were things that I could present on a piece of paper and show them a screenshot that I supported state employees receiving a increase in salary. Not only that, I also supported a $65 million increase of what was on the budget. Didn't matter. They still didn't believe that I supported the employees, just on hearsay. So there was a lot of things that happened on that. The other thing that was really interesting is I was talking to some of my colleagues in Jackson. There were races in Jackson, just this in the general, that they liked you. They really liked the points you made and the things you did, and you were an independent. But when it came to the actual voting, they voted party line no matter what. So they liked you as a person. They liked what you did for your community. They like everything that you have done. But when it came to voting, that didn't matter. The issues didn't matter. They voted party line. So there's a big disconnect going on between what is actually happening, what's being done. I actually brought a lot of money to my community this last session. So it's not like something was disconnected multiple sessions. This immediate last session, I brought a lot of money to our community between agricultural infrastructure, between mental health and jobs, as well as redistricting, kept our entire county whole for the first time in history ever, and they didn't care. So I am very active in my community, donate a lot of time, a lot of money to my community. They didn't care. So we had people who had actual solutions and actual things that happened. It didn't matter. So there's a big pendulum swing. And I think what's going to happen is everybody talks about, the pendulum swing coming back. But I think a lot of people are going to have to live with some of this and see it for themselves and feel the pain and feel the hurt of the potholes, the lack of snow plows, the lack of, infrastructure, and some of these things that we incumbents that got hurt in this, they're going to have to feel some of that pain before they understand some of the rhetoric and some of what's going on. And same with the school board. I related it to some locals that you have a situation where you have the loud parent yelling and screaming at the coach, and the loud parent screaming and yelling at the and they put him on the little league board, or they put him on the as a coach, and then they just all of a sudden discover this isn't as easy as I thought it was, and it's a lot harder. And that's basically what's going to end up happening. So hopefully, I'm positive that hopefully, it always spins back around and people learn. But the big problem I have right now in Wyoming is the two different sides, they're not talking. I'm talking to try and understand where they come from. I'm talking to try and listen and learn and empathy. Other sides just aren't listening, or they're not talking to listen. And we got to get past that.
Thank you, Representative Duncan. Next, we've got Matt Germer.
Thank you. I'm here to provide a bit of some national context for how the election went this week. Let me bring up a presentation I put together. And as that comes up, I want to share a couple notes with folks. One, election results are constantly changing as more votes come in. So what I'm going to put in front of you is still in flux. This is all accurate, at least as far as noon today, Mountain Time, as I put this together. And so with that in mind, I'll be brief because there's just so much that happened all across the country in the last week. So we'll start off with just some high-level national takeaways from the midterms. One thing that really stuck out to me as part of the results was that voters want stability. This was an election that was seen, at some points to be a red tsunami or a red wave, ended up being more of a red trickle or a red puddle, depending on where you were. In no small part because incumbents did very well on both sides of the aisle. You can look at incumbent governors from Ron DeSantis to Brian Kemp to Phil Scott, a Republican in Vermont, overwhelmingly reelected, to Democrats like Jared Polis, who did very well in Colorado. For all the attention that Ron DeSantis got in Florida for running up the score, there very little national attention was put onto Colorado, where Democrats kind of ran up the score. So incumbents did generally very well. That said, that's true if they made it through the primary. Primary season this year was very disruptive all across the country, but predominantly among Republicans in red states, where there was a fervor to move further to the right. States like Wyoming, as has been discussed, have been experiencing a bit of this phenomenon, as well as states like Idaho, Arizona, and a few others. Another major takeaway along the lines of stability is that, at least as I see it, Joe Biden turned out not to really be a lightning rod. He ran a relatively sleepy role in the campaign, was not making kind of a whistle-stop tour across the country. The day of the election, the White House stopped taking press inquiries at noon Eastern time, and he stayed back. Meanwhile, voters had their eyes on Trump, whether it was on Trump himself or on his surrogates kind of throughout the country, people who identified their platforms through him. And that seemed to play a role. It ties into this next point, which was that independents largely rejected fringe platforms. And in this particular cycle, fringe platforms were more associated with Republicans for one reason or another. And so independent voters we saw breaking for Democrats. Across the country, that was about a 4-point clip, which for an election that was meant to be a red wave is not the kind of thing you would expect out of a red wave, particularly in key elections. Pennsylvania, independents broke for Democrats by 18 points. In Georgia by 28, Arizona by 30. Those are numbers that indicate that voters were not intrigued by whether it was Mastriano or Oz or Herschel Walker or Kerry Lake or Blake Masters in those states, which ties to the next point, which was that on the whole, this election pointed out that candidate quality mattered. Candidates who ran with their own strong record, who had an independent, strong brand, got strong results. And that would be seen through split ticketing among Republican candidates predominantly. I'm going to bring up a chart here. Hopefully everyone can read it, but if not, the main takeaway is that there were a number of states where candidates who had a record significantly outdrew those who tied themselves to more fringe perspective. So Sununu ran a dozen points ahead of Baldock in New Hampshire. Though they were both of the same party, a ton of voters were willing to split their tickets. Same was true in Georgia, where Brian Kemp ran ahead of Herschel Walker. And Mehmet Oz, who was not an incumbent, but was not nearly as known for his connection to the Stop the Steal movement as Doug Mastriano was. And again, voters seem to be willing to split tickets in those states. So looking at my favorite kind of subjects, electoral reform, how did that do on the ballot at the national level? Well, it was on the ballot in a number of states. The first state that was where it was on the ballot statewide was in Nevada. This was a ballot initiative that would put in place Final Five voting, an idea I think that is being discussed within Wyoming, where it really could make a difference. This is a situation where you have an open primary. The top 5 vote getters in the primary move on to the general election. There they compete in a ranked choice election. A lot of folks thought that that particular initiative had no chance. It's currently up. Now, there's a lot of ballots still left to be counted in Nevada, but ranked choice voting might end up being the law in Nevada, and we will see how that turns out. Washington State, on the other hand, a state that currently uses top 2, was a little less excited about ranked choice voting. It was on the ballot in San Juan County, a relatively left-leaning county on the coast, Clark County, a purple county in Southwest that's on the border with Portland, and in Seattle. In San Juan and Clark, it went down. There's still a lot of ballots to be counted, but not enough to overcome those gaps. Seattle is more interesting. There are quite a few more ballots to be counted in King County, where Seattle is, and it's a razor thin margin and a special circumstance. So you might see in those numbers, it's within a percent or two. The question in Seattle was, do you want to change our primary elections? Yes or no? So that's the first number you see there. The 49.2 and the 50.8 is, do you want to change the primaries? If yes wins, it moves to a second question. Do you like approval voting, where you put an X next to every candidate you're okay with? Or would you prefer ranked choice voting? Right now, ranked choice voting is winning that fight 3-1. So if that first question, do you want to make a change to our primaries, ends up going through, it looks like ranked choice voting may end up happening in Seattle. Multnomah, which is Portland's county, or most of Portland's county, as well as the city of Portland itself, approved ranked choice voting. Fort Collins, Colorado, approved ranked choice voting. Evanston, Illinois, overwhelmingly approved ranked choice voting, extremely popular among voters there. And Ojai, California also approved it. So across the country, it was a big night for electoral reform on the ballot, with perhaps Seattle being and Nevada being the last 2 to really be worked out as ballots come in. How did elections do that used RCV? This was something I've been keeping my eye on. We have 2 states that use ranked choice voting for all of their elections across their statewide offices, Alaska and Maine. And in those states, for Alaska and for Maine, both in those cases, no runoff required for their governor races. They both hit 50%. The 1st congressional district in Maine also does not require a runoff. It hit a 60% winner. The at-large House district in Alaska, the Senate district in Alaska, and the 2nd congressional district in Maine will require a runoff. And here's a little bit of detail as we head into that. So the Senate race in Alaska will be won by a Republican. That is known at this point. There were 3 candidates who made it through. The Democrat will be knocked out, and those votes will be reallocated to one of the 2 Republicans. Odds are at this point that it's Murkowski, but we've seen in Alaska that that's not a guarantee that people will choose a second place choice. And so it's yet to be determined. We likely won't know the results for a couple of weeks, since they still need to collect all of the ballots before they run this analysis. In the at-large House district, it's a little more complicated. For folks who've been following this race, there was a special election in Alaska using these new rules, where Democrat Mary Peltola defeated Republican Sarah Palin and Paul Begich. Palin and Begich are institutional names in Alaska, with strong feelings attached, particularly with Palin. She's got about a 60% disapproval rating among all Alaskans, which naturally includes a lot of Republicans who are just not a big fan of hers. Peltola won the election in August on a fairly moderate message. What I've been telling folks is she might end up being like the Joe Manchin of the House. She's fairly pro-energy. She's pro-commercial fishing. She is caucusing with the Democrats and likely will vote with them for many things, but she is not running a very progressive platform. She's currently in the lead for the first round of voting, but that is a lot of Begich voters if he ends up being in 3rd place, who will need to be reallocated. And what we saw in August was that many of them either didn't vote for anyone in the next round or were willing to vote for Peltola. This is not a guarantee that all of those votes will move over to Sarah Palin. So we will wait to see how that ends up turning out. decent likelihood, I think Peltola ends up winning that one. That's where I would put my money at this point. Folks who chose Begich kind of did so with a reason because they don't really like Sarah Palin. So that one remains to be seen. And then the second congressional district in Maine, this is actually a rematch, not just of those two candidates, but of all three. They have faced each other previously. Golden is the incumbent. He holds the seat. Bruce Poliquin is challenging to get his seat back that he lost in a previous ranked choice election. Tiffany Bond is the independent, though her voters tend to lean left. In a previous ranked choice election that these same candidates participated in, now almost all of Bond's voters ultimately went to the Democratic candidate. So looking at those numbers, again, it seems quite likely that Golden will win. So at a high level, how are these going to go? Murkowski seems in a good place to collect the remaining voters, Peltola as well as Golden. My 2 cents as I look at this is that as someone who works predominantly with folks kind of on the center right on ranked choice voting elections, this doesn't help my narrative. I want to be able to go out and say ranked choice voting isn't some liberal plot, and having the result come back that ruby red Alaska goes blue and that Maine stays blue doesn't help. But on the other hand, it almost shows how these systems were designed to work. Palin is not a middle of the road Republican candidate. She's not even like in the middle of Republicans kind of candidate. She's not well liked by a lot of Republicans. And so there's a certain justice to saying that should make it a little harder for you to win. And so perhaps ranked, and Peltola, on the other hand, is not running a very progressive campaign. And if she had, it's unlikely she would have gathered as much support as she did. So this is, in my mind, actually evidence the system is working. I guess one last note I'll point out in that Alaska race, because it's a rematch after just a couple of months after a special election, it was interesting to watch the dynamics of the race change. In the special election, Sarah Palin went almost scorched earth on ranked choice voting in general, was going after her opponents. And perhaps then it's no wonder that many Begich voters said, fine, you're not getting my second place vote. This next time around, they've made a concerted effort to change the way they were talking about the election, both Palin and Begich, for what it's worth. It's like they got a call from Kevin McCarthy, and they were telling their voters, rank the red. It doesn't matter which of us you put first, just make sure you put both of us on there. We'll be interested to see if their voters end up doing that. And if so, again, that kind of shows that the incentive structure of ranked choice voting encourages people to reach out to their opponent's candidates or their opponent's voters in a way that in the first round, it was evident they hadn't learned yet. So just to summarize all of this again, at the national level, what I picked up is voters were looking for stability. People tended to reject fringe platforms, and candidate quality matters. I think all of those are naturally good things. Now, there might be questions about whether each individual race turned out the way any person wanted it to, but I think at a high level, those are healthy lessons for our republic. And on electoral reform, I think we're seeing great progress on voters being willing to shake things up in the right way, particularly in Nevada. I'm excited about that one, and ranked choice voting seems to be working, but that the partisan direction that it functioned in this election can make a challenge for folks like me who are interested in kind of talking to a wide variety of voters about this. So that's it.
Wonderful. And now we've got our last panelist, Stan Lockhart.
I'm glad to join you this evening. A couple of trivia notes before I get into my topic of how ranked choice voting is working in Utah. My late wife, Becky, was the star of our family in elected office, but I've also been on a city council. I've been on the State Board of Education, and I served as chairman of the Utah Republican Party. So I have my own little bio here with some credentials. And one note of interest to the people watching this webinar, my mother comes from a long history of being from Wyoming. She's from Thermopolis. Her last name is Tippett, and I know that's a common name in that part of the state. So anyway, I have some Wyoming roots. In Utah, we've been experimenting with ranked choice voting for about 20 years within our political parties. In the mid-1990s, some conservative grassroots activists brought ranked choice voting to the Republican Party, wanting to use it at our conventions and in our caucuses. And I was a part of the establishment And you know, the establishment and grassroots activists are like oil and water. So whatever they were in favor of, I was against. And so for many years, I was against ranked choice voting just because they were in favor of it. But as we started using it in our conventions, we took 10-hour conventions and turned them into 3 or 4 hour conventions. And that immediately got my attention. And lo and behold, the outcomes were about the same as you would expect in a plurality election. And so after a while, I learned that you had nothing to fear from ranked choice voting. And then as I've dug deeper into the benefits of ranked choice voting, I really believe it has potential to reduce the amount of vitriol and the amount of polarization that we're facing in our elections. And that's important to me because the future of our country hinges on our ability to have people of varying viewpoints come together and reason through issues and find common ground. And ranked choice voting has the potential to help do that during our elections. And certainly there's a lot of proof of that in the elections that have taken place. For years, legislators would run ranked choice voting bills in our state to use ranked choice voting in public elections, and they could not get their bills out of the rules. And in 2017, arguably the most liberal member of our House of Representatives ran a bill that put ranked choice voting into partisan elections. And arguably the most conservative member of our state house co-sponsored the bill. And when the body, when the House saw that these two legislators were co-sponsoring a bill, I think it was unheard of at the time. They got on board and by a huge margin passed ranked choice voting out of the House. I think it was 57 yay votes to 13 no votes, something along those lines. So that was quite a surprise to everyone because up until then we couldn't get a bill out of rules. Well, it went to the Senate and it died in committee on a 3-3 vote. And about that time, I was recruited by those involved in ranked choice voting to figure out what was going on in Utah, what was in the water, what was causing the House to do what they did, and then what it would take for the Senate to go along with ranked choice voting. So over the course of a summer and talking to many, many legislators one-on-one and visiting them in their work and in their home, I found that the concern with the Senate was that they just didn't know how Utah voters would respond to this new way of voting. And they weren't comfortable implementing it into partisan races until they could see how voters felt. And so as the summer went on and I started having these conversations and continued to have conversations with House members, we came to the conclusion that a local option bill for city elections was the way for us to see how Utah voters would respond to ranked choice voting. So in the 2018 legislative session, we passed a bill almost unanimously that allowed cities to use ranked choice voting in their elections. Well, that was great. So we went ahead and then once we passed that bill, then every year thereafter for 3 or 4 years, we had to pass some small modifications to strengthen the provisions of the bill and make it work well in Utah. The first year, we had 2 cities opt in. Now, we would have had more cities opt in, but our county clerks did not want the disruption of having to run multiple kinds of elections in their county. So we only found 1 county clerk who was willing to administer it and 2 cities in that county that ran it. We had a wonderful result. We did some polling. Well, the county clerk did polling after the election of voters and found that 82% not only liked it, but wanted to use it again. And these 2 cities were really different. One was the fastest growing city in America between 2010 and 2020. And the other city was one of our charter cities in the state, had this long history with multi-generational families living in the same city and kind of more of an older demographic, whereas the fast growing city was a young demographic. But the results were very similar as the polling came back, and combined 82% liked it and wanted to use it again. And they understood it. They very quickly clued into how it works. And and everybody liked the experience in 2019. So in 2021, cities started clamoring for it all over the state, and county clerks grudgingly expressed willingness to go ahead and use it. And so we ended up with 23 cities in 2021 using ranked choice voting. Somewhere around 40% of all voters in the state had the opportunity to use ranked choice voting in 2021 in Utah. And again, we had very, very positive results up and down the line. This time, about 65% of the voters liked it and wanted to use it again. But 90% understood it, found it easy to use, and so the polling was very similar. There were a couple of races that didn't turn out the way you would imagine they would turn out. In the second largest city in the state, we had a liberal Democrat become mayor in a generally conservative city. And the interesting thing, though, is that she was leading in the first round and kept leading in the rounds subsequent to that. In fact, the winners of every race in those cities, and by the way, 3 of those cities didn't have enough candidates to trigger ranked choice voting. So we ended up with ranked choice voting in 20 cities. And in all of the races that took place, dozens and dozens of races, the winning candidate finished either first or second in the first round. And so there were no odd outcomes per se. And the voters spoke, and it was very positive. So we're trying to get ranked choice voting into partisan elections. What we've gotten so far is a nice basket of data on how voters like ranked choice voting and how they respond to it. We have 2 more cycles to finish the pilot, 2023 and 2025. Every year we go to the legislature and we start talking to them about the data that we've gathered, both the qualitative data of the polling and the quantitative data of how the elections turned out. And we're having ongoing conversations about using ranked choice voting in partisan elections. And we have a specific problem that the legislature is looking to solve that gives us hope. In our primaries, we have multiple ways to get on the ballot. You've got the caucus convention system that can send up to 2 candidates to the primary ballot per party. And we have a signature gathering route to the ballot. And so in some races in recent years, we've had as many as 4 candidates on the ballot. And we've had a candidate for Congress win with 30.9%, and another candidate for governor get nominated with 36.5%. And so these small plurality winners bring into question what is the percentage that someone needs to have in order to be considered a winner. And I think 200 years ago, it was kind of 50% plus 1, but we've entered a time where in plurality elections, it can be less than 50%, and no one questions whether it's a legitimate win or not. But when you get down to less than 1/3 of the voters approving of a candidate and allowing them to move forward, maybe there needs to be a different process in place that can help find a majority. And so right now the legislature is looking to solve what we call the plurality issue using ranked choice voting. So we'll see how that goes. We think it's going to take us a little while longer with the discussions of election integrity. Somehow ranked choice voting has gotten lumped into that, even though it really has nothing to do with the integrity of an election. Ranked choice voting is fully auditable, which means that you can go in and look in detail and see how the votes are distributed and anonymously see how people are voting in aggregate, so that you can know that no improprieties are taking place. And so we're optimistic that over time we're going to have enough data that legislators will say, yeah, now's the time. Let's go ahead and use ranked choice voting in partisan elections.
Thank you for the color on that. Appreciate getting some context, especially from the national level, and how that differs from what we've seen in Wyoming, some similar, some not. And Stan, especially on the party side, that's really an interesting perspective to gain not only from elections as a public in the public sphere, but also on the party side. So thanks for that. We got a question here. How do you see the decreased civility and increased emotion from this election cycle playing out in the Wyoming legislature over the next 2 years? And Representative Duncan, you mentioned this just a bit, but would love some color on that.
Thanks for the question. I think it's going to be really difficult because you can't help but take it personal. You know, we become a family. We're there until sometimes 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. My first session, I was there till 2:30 in the morning. And I sit there and I work with these people, and the things that you say or your campaign says to your family, it's going to be really hard for those people who are there now and remain there to open you with, open arms and welcome you in after you've trashed, a lot of your former colleagues and people, a lot of people who have been there for a long time. So that's going to be hard to get past. The other thing is it's really difficult. I worked really hard, of course, being a realtor. Our job is to negotiate. Our job is to read people. Our job is to find a common ground and to bring people to the table. Not everybody in the legislature with all the, because we're a citizens legislature, not everybody has that kind of skill set to actually work with different personalities to try and bring people together. So you've got emotion, you've got friendships, and you've got skill sets, and not everybody has the same kind of skill sets. So that's going to be really difficult. But, one of the things I prided myself on was asking people, why did you make the decision you made and voted the way you did? So not because I'm objecting to you because you voted no. I want to know why you voted no so that I can learn that maybe I should have voted no, or your experience may be different than my experience. And I really work to foster those relationships. So it's going to take a lot for this whole new group of people to come in and really try and work on those relationships and start dialogue. There's a lot that are just plant their flag and vote no for the sake of voting no, and people don't appreciate that. I've always really appreciated if you vote no and you plant your flag, great, because you have a reason. Great. I just want to know why. Maybe you can tell me others, because we all have a different experience. So we just need to have that dialogue, and there's a lot who aren't willing to have that dialogue. So that's what's going to happen. And until those chips on the shoulder and those, egos get pushed aside, and we actually talk to understand instead of talking to listen or to answer, we're going to have a lot of roadblocks. And I think that's in any business, but especially in this critical situation where there's such a divide. We just have to quit putting our personalities and our defensiveness up and just try and understand why you're voting the way you are, why you're answering the way you are, where are you coming from? And if we could do that more without an agenda, even though, and appreciate why they're voting the way they are, maybe we can get past some of this, but it's going to take some work.
Thank you for that. Matt, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to add a little thing, and I'm not, a native Wyoming resident. This is not my experience in your state, but I have a feeling there's some commonality here. I spent quite a few years working in the state house in Washington state and in Oregon. And one thing that really sticks out to me on this particular question is how many bills aren't divisive. There are a lot of things that are largely agreeable for everyone. And to get the most out of those bills and out of those experiences and to bring the goods back to your district and your constituents, you have to be able to get along. And so there's a real need for civility when the issues are tough, but there's also a need for civility because of how many things actually you can work together on or should be able to work together on. But if you've got personal divisiveness and you have a lack of relationships, it just acts as an interruption to day-to-day business that shouldn't be divisive.
I just want to tag on to what Matt said. One of the big things that people don't understand is if you really broke down we have 500 to 600 bills that are introduced in a regular general session. And if you look at the majority of those bills, a big chunk and majority of those bills are nonpartisan. They really have no, partisan issue in them. It's just the handful that are such very big partisan issues. And it seems like there's like 5 or 6 that are the exact same bill, but they're on both sides. They make a big splash and they're very loud. And really, in some ways, this is what I've been asking my colleagues. We have the trigger bill that went into effect and law. Of course, it's being debated right now with the Supreme Court and such, but there's that bill. We are the most liberal state when it comes to guns. How much more can we fight for gun, bills? I mean, it's like, what more is there to fight for? And so there's so many things that are just the rhetoric that we keep fighting for that we already have, we've already done all that. So, if we would just pay attention to a lot of the good work that we do, there's so many hundreds and hundreds of bills that have no partisanship to it, and just concentrate on that. And, there's still some of that's because we're televised now, YouTube and things like that. That's thrown in a whole new thing where we have a lot of campaign stump speeches still, and we're talking to the masses at the mic. And if we could have a rule, I've asked this from day one, if we could have a rule where we time the debate and you're only allowed this much, people would actually do the work instead of talking rhetoric to beyond the room. And that's part of the problem, is they're talking to their silos beyond the room rather than to the people in the room and actually debating the bill. So, and if we had strong leadership that kept people on task and on track to work on the subject at hand and not this stuff out here, we would get a lot more work done too. But that's just the taskmaster of, come on, stay on task, people. So.
Well, thank you for that. Anything more on this question? I appreciate that. And again, back to Stan's point about, the ranked choice voting necessitating candidates and electeds reaching out, and thus, an avenue for civility. I think we need to keep that in mind. We're going to pivot a little bit. I'm going to ask a question from the audience. And this is to our national folks more than to Representative Duncan, but how do you educate grassroots citizens to understand and possibly advocate for open primaries and ranked choice voting?
So I'm happy to go first on that question. There are a couple things to keep in mind. One, different audiences will respond to different messages. So it's extremely important to keep in mind who you're talking to and what the context is. For folks who are just hearing about the ideas for the first time, I think it helps to start with kind of where the problem is. The basic structure of our elections across the country is that we have partisan primaries where each party will pick their favorite representative that champions their values in the primary. And that incentivizes those candidates to be the biggest, best version of the partisan that they possibly can. And then they're asked to pivot in many places toward the general election. And that would theoretically encourage them to make sure their campaign is as most inclusive as it can be to get across the finish line and garner the most support. Where that is largely broken down is that we don't live in competitive districts at this point, whether that is at the state legislative level, the congressional level, or even honestly, to some extent, the Senate level, which are the borders of our states aren't creating purple states. And people are moving into states in no small part because they're looking for a cultural match. And that's creating an environment where really just the primary election is determining our leadership across the country. Some states have closed primaries. Only registered members of the party can participate in those primaries. So largely an incredibly small amount of partisan activists, believers, and engaged partisans are the ones picking who ultimately represents the entire district or the entire state. For some folks, if they are in that crowd, I mean, they're going to have no problem with the way that this is working, at least as far as they'll look at their representative and say, that's exactly who I want there. The problem is that there are millions of voters who are unsatisfied with the way that that's working, and that the incentive structure that's in place is unhelpful. So that's a lot of throwing it out there, but I think the best place to start with a lot of folks is to kind of walk through the fact that we have a problem in our country that a very, very small minority of people are the ones picking elected leadership for everyone. That's a strong argument for opening up our primary system so that everyone can participate. And so that's one thing. That's for one audience. I guess I'll note, because I'm not going to be here all night, because I could talk about this all night. For a different audience, I think there's a really strong argument to say parties play a different role these days than they did when party primaries first launched. If you want to go back in time, we didn't have primaries. The parties would either get together at a convention. We have our famous smoke-filled rooms, and partisan leaders would come and say, this is our nominee, and we will present them to the people and they will pick. That was not democratic enough for our culture, and we said we want more say. And so the party primary system began a little over 100 years ago, and has grown to be just ubiquitous. We all expect it now. That has diminished to some extent the role of the party. Now it's become a democratized thing. And in many states, primaries aren't about the party picking their favorite nominee. It's just a winnowing process. And I know that Wyoming's a little different, but in states like that have party like open primaries and with tons of people on the ballot, it's about bringing it to the most competitive candidates who have the most support and then having them square off. So the nature of our primary system has changed. And with that, I think it's a good opportunity to say, should we be rethinking our primaries in general? They were designed to solve a different problem, and now they're creating their own set of problems. So that's about open primaries. RCV, I think, is a different kind of argument. It's about ensuring that people have choice when it comes to their election, that they don't feel like they're stuck between a lesser of two evils. How many elections we've been a part of where you feel like you have to hold your nose and pick the better of two options you're not happy with? Ranked choice voting at least creates an incentive that says you get to pick for whoever you actually like. And if that person's not viable, then you're not just throwing away your vote. This idea of a spoiler effect or a wasted vote is dramatically diminished with ranked choice voting. You can vote your conscience, but also still have an impact on the overall outcome of the election. I think for a lot of folks, that's really attractive. You can think of whatever race you've ever participated in where you didn't really like the people running and the options you were given. Ranked choice voting really helps to address that. And so I try to talk about it to people based on what experience they have, what state they're in, what their local elected offices are like, and show practically how either open primaries or ranked choice voting, or the combination of the two in particular, can be really powerful for giving voters more voice and more options, and lesser of two evils, or less a small minority of people ultimately deciding the outcome for everyone.
So let me get my 2 bits on this. Most of the time, I'm trying to persuade conservative Republicans about ranked choice voting. So in Utah, we say that we're conservative by principle and pragmatic by process. And so we try to look at issues on the pros and cons, and then come to agreement on what works best for our state. And that's the same with ranked choice voting in elections as well. And so I've always found that when I can get to the heart of these issues and talk about the greater degree of civility and the fact that you can get someone to a majority, I often say with ranked choice voting that it's when you have plurality voting, there are a whole bunch of people that are really happy and a whole bunch of people that are really unhappy. And with ranked choice voting, you have a spectrum of happiness where more voters are pretty happy with the results. And that's good. That's a good thing, that we can have more people happy with the results of our elections. And so I like to start with our founders. I start with what the framers of the Constitution had in mind when they created this republic with a representative form of government. And the election is the critical piece to that form of government working. And so we've got to have great elections. And we have lots and lots of problems with elections that are plurality elections. And like we could spend another hour just talking about the problems that we have when you run plurality elections. But polarization is one of the byproducts of it. And so with ranked choice voting, I start talking about, first of all, they didn't ever talk about the method of voting in the Constitutional Convention. That wasn't a topic of discussion. Now, they talked about how to elect the president and spent numerous days having that discussion with many, many votes, but they didn't ever talk about how to have an election. And I think it's because they just didn't have a lot of experience with elections. They had been used to being ruled by a king. And so they were pretty much taking whatever they had at the time, and they didn't dive deep into it to try to figure out how to best have these things. But we do know that our framers were worried about our American experiment succeeding. So we have Ben Franklin, when he came out of the Constitutional Convention, and the lady said, "Mr. Franklin, what do we have, a monarchy or a republic?" He said, "A republic, if you can keep it," right? If you can keep it. Thomas Jefferson said that an informed citizenry is the best defense against tyranny. Well, how do you get an informed citizenry in this day and age? We find many, many voters just don't spend a lot of time thinking about the election or thinking about who to vote for. Ranked choice voting gives a heavy incentive on going on to websites and looking at what candidates stand for, looking at how they are relative to other candidates so that you can make a choice. And so it causes a deeper level of thinking. You've got to work harder with ranked choice voting to make your selections. And that is very consistent with what our founders had in mind. So we talk a lot about original intent with conservatives. We want to be faithful to what the framers had in mind when they created this form of government. And ranked choice voting, as you work through it with them and you start talking about the pros and the cons to ranked choice voting, very, very quickly you find that it's consistent with the ideas that the framers had and expressed in numerous documents, including the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers and stuff like that.
Thank you for that. We've got some really great questions here, but unfortunately we're starting to wind down. I'm going to give the panelists each a minute to include any concluding statements they've got, and then we'll wrap it up. And we'd like to thank everyone for coming. This has been a great discussion this evening. Thank you. I guess Representative Duncan, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Oh, thank you for including me. I think the biggest thing and the biggest takeaway is the silent majority has had apathy for a long time and need to quit. And my favorite quote is always, I have two quotes. "He was silent, gives permission." There's a lot to that that you need to make sure that you make what your concerns are. Let your representative or your senator know. Let your school board member, let your city councilor, let those people know. Because a lot of times as a legislator, I heard from the same 10 people. The most I heard from was from an obscure bill, and I heard from half my county, and I was like, what? And so you really need to reach out, because they will answer you, they will do something. So the other part is, if you don't have a seat at the table, you might as well be on the menu. That was the quote that I originally ran for office for. I wanted to be a seat at the table. Go and participate. Go to the meetings. Go to the testimonies. So if there is something that you are interested in and you are passionate about, watch the YouTube, be engaged, show up, go to the school board meetings, go to the county commissioner meetings, be informed so that you understand and know what's going on. If you're not getting the answers you want, then reach out and ask. They are more than willing to talk to you and understand. Most of them, they want to know. they want to hear from you. They want to hear your side. So if anything I could get across to everyone is be informed and reach out to your legislators, any of your electeds.
Thank you for that, and I appreciate the call for action. If nothing more than knowing the topics and being involved and voting. So thank you for that. Matt, do you have some concluding comments?
Yeah, as a concluding comment, I will actually do the best I can to answer one of the questions that was provided in the chat. So I'll try to do my best in 1 minute here. So one of the questions was, Wyoming has a supermajority. How does ranked choice voting fit in that kind of environment? And I will point out something that we've kind of mentioned, but specifically in that context, my view, ranked choice voting or instant runoff, however you want to phrase it, works really well when voters like many candidates. A supermajority type environment can be the perfect environment for those kinds of elections because voters will then be engaged in actually grappling with multiple candidates. And instead of having intra-party fighting, you've got arguments for why maybe I'm the best candidate, but even if you can't put me number one, here's why you should put me number two. And that creates an environment of affirmative, forward-looking, positive campaigning. It's not going to get rid of all negative campaigning. It's not a silver bullet. People will still sling mud, but at least it creates incentives toward more positive campaigning and a healthier political environment. And I don't think that that's limited to a highly, cross-partisan environment. It works very well, even if everyone belongs to the same party. So I think that's an interesting takeaway. And again, maybe this even touches on the question of how can I talk to other people about this issue? If your circumstance is that you live in an overwhelmingly red area, this gives voters more choice among which shade of red they like the most, and encourages candidates to work with each other as opposed to tearing each other down.
Wonderful. Thank you. Stan, concluding comments?
So there are so many games that are played with plurality voting, and ranked choice voting solves so many of those problems. I mean, literally, you have to do a math equation in your head to figure out who to vote for many times with plurality voting. Let's see. My favorite candidate doesn't have a chance, so I've got to vote between two candidates I really don't like very well because that's the only way that I can be relevant in this election. Or I really dislike that candidate. Who do I vote for who has the best chance of beating the person I dislike the most? Or maybe you're a part of a minor party and you're like, golly, I can't even vote for someone from my party because they have no chance in this race. So I got to vote for someone else. But you've got all these mathematical calculations you've got to run just to figure out who to vote for in plurality voting. Ranked choice voting solves all of that. You don't have to, it's so pure for the voter. Who do I like the most? Make them number one. Who do I like the second most? Rank them number two. Who do I like the third most? Rank them number three. If your number one never gets the fewest number of votes, then that number one you'll stay with your number one choice through the entire election. If for some reason your number one goes out early and it has the fewest number and so they go out, then your number two clicks in, but only if your number one goes out. And so truly the person who you like the very most will be in the final round of voting and your vote will count. It is a fuller expression of voter will. And isn't that really what this country is all about, is the fullest expression of voter will so that the majority can choose who represents them in government in this republic of ours? So I'm a full-throated believer in ranked choice voting. I've looked at many different types of voting. I think it's the best alternative to what we have today and to everything else that is out there. And I would highly recommend you trying ranked choice voting in elections in Wyoming.
Thank you for that. Thank you all so much for coming to our November People's Review Live. I'm going to hand it back to Jen.
You guys, that was great. That was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I know we're all so busy, and the fact that you took time out to talk about this important issue to ESPC members and supporters means a lot to me and to our board of directors. I too could stay here all night talking about this stuff, but it is 6 o'clock, so I want to give you back your time. Thanks for joining us tonight. ESPC is a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit organization. If you'd like to donate it to us and support this work, please reach out to me and I will let you know how to do that. Again, thank you to our leadership circle. If you have interest in learning more about that, please do reach out to me. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here tonight. We're going to take December off, but we will see you in January as we prepare for the legislative session. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night.